Hi, I'm Dr. Terry Burns, and I'm going to be talking to you today about the Hieroglyphic Monad of Dr. John Dee of London. We're going to go through over the next several videos, and I'm going to take you through an explanation of his letter to King Maximilian, his letter to the printer, and all 24 theorems. Yes, the Hieroglyphic Monad can be understood. I know it has become commonplace in the 450 years since Dee wrote it to say that, oh, it's opaque, you can't understand it. But that's because the people who were saying it, of course, didn't understand it. I have a little bit of street cred on this issue. I'm the co-translator with my friend, Dr. Nancy Turner, of the most recent translation of the Hieroglyphic Monad, which was put out in 2020 by Ouroboros Press. Nancy and I started that translation in 2007, believe it or not. So when I say that what it takes to understand the Hieroglyphic Monad is time, I've put in the time, so you don't have to, I hope. It can be understood. And of course, I think ours is the best translation, but that's because we're standing on the shoulders of all these great people who went before us. If you're joining me today, you probably at least know who John Dee is and that the Hieroglyphic Monad is a text that he wrote, probably one that everyone says they don't understand. Maybe you're a John Dee scholar. If you are, awesome. So am I. I've walked that walk and talked that talk, but what I'm doing now are making YouTube videos. So if you are an assistant professor or a graduate student and you still have to publish your parish, okay, I'm lucky I don't have to anymore. I'm a retired full professor emerita, and I've done that and moved on to other things. But I'm going to be tossing out lots of areas where even if you understand the monad, there are still other things people can look at. That will be my whole last video, so I don't bog down the earlier part of it too much with that. But I would ask you a favor. Please try to understand it first. I'm going to do everything in my power to help you. And if I miss something, ask a question below. I genuinely love to answer it. But please don't do, as I have heard many people do at conferences, something like, oh, getting very excited that, look, Athanasius Kircher in this text after Dee died is using the same Hebrew letters and saying the same thing that John Dee said in his letter to Maximilian in the Hieroglyphic Monad, to which I remember thinking, yeah, and so what? Or look, Dee makes up a word in Latin. He talks about a voarcha magus, and it's got to be an allusion to this book, the Voarchidamia of Pantheus. It was in his library. And I'm there thinking, yeah, like, and what? Like, how does this help me understand this text? And how does it help me use it to do, like, whatever it is I want to do? Maybe since I was a language and literature professor, it's just I want to understand the beauty of the language and all the allusions. But since most people don't sort of get the charge that I do out of like poetic play in Latin, maybe it's to understand how this sets up his Enochian book, how it allows you to visualize forms if you're a ceremonial magician. What is his idea of the cosmogenesis, since this is a cosmogenic text or a text that talks about how light comes into matter? Please understand it first. Okay. And if you could care less what academics think about the monad, but you're just interested in it, either as a casual aficionado of the Western mystery tradition, or sacred geometry, or a ceremonial magician, I think there will be a lot here for you. In fact, since Dee is an expert in ancient Greek geometry, more on that in just a second, you will find some pretty amazing parallels between what you do if you are, say, casting a circle or casting a pentagram, and the type of visualization that you are taken through in an ancient Greek geometric text. John Dee is a young man, and the time of Henry VIII was an underreader in ancient Greek in Cambridge. By the time he is an adult, and well, by the time he has survived two more rulers and his patron is Queen Elizabeth I, He is probably the premier expert on ancient Greek in England, and without a doubt, no one comes even close. He is the expert on ancient Greek geometry, which of course he reads in the original. And ancient geometric texts are not like what you or I may have studied in high school. They don't use numbers, and they assume that you already have the answer. If you studied Plato's forms, you know the idea that, like, oh, I'm sitting in a chair, but somewhere there is this perfect form of a chair. Well, the first forms are geometric forms. Think Platonic solids. Think Plato's Timaeus. I'll talk about that much more in a later video. But the way you work through a theorem is even shown by the verb tense and what some scholars call the helping hand that is there to help you get the problem right. So if you literally translated it, you'd get a proof. You might have something like, okay, having drawn two parallel lines, the perpendicular will have been dropped and da 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 da. In other words, this will have been, it's a future perfect progressive if anyone cares, but there is no quiz on that. It's the idea that you should be doing this in your mind and you're trying to match up with this perfect form. My old friend Vincent Bridges used to say that if you had walked by Dee's home in Mortlake and you were clairvoyant, you'd probably be struck by just like all the astral clutter of this genius guy inside Mortlake visualizing this form, and you have to transform them. So you turn it into this, flipping it in dimension. So, all right, you draw a circle, but implicitly that's a sphere, or you draw a square and implicitly that's a cube. Actually, one of the things that makes me love the monad so much is Dee seems to have kind of stumbled onto the idea of higher dimensions in a time when there's no words in English. Like Dee is a generation before Shakespeare, so there's no word for the fourth dimension, the fifth dimension. So he describes it with this like delightfully strange imagery that is a combination of stuff from ancient Greek geometry, apocalyptic Christian revelation, and Kabbalah. I mean, it's just weird, and it's so weird, it's wonderful. Another thing you need to do, by the way, is you need to draw everything in ancient Greek geometry with a compass and straight edge. We'll talk later about metaphysical reasons why a compass and straight edge are really important, but it's not unique to Western culture, just by the way. Later, I'll be showing you a picture of this really cool Chinese tapestry where you see the brother and sister who are the legendary founders of China, one of them holding a compass over their head and the other a straight edge. Of course, we also think of compass and straight edge as Masonic symbols, drafting tools, and so forth. Okay, since I am talking about geometry, by the way, it'd be a good time for me to thank my sponsors, Geometric Models. There's a link to their website below and their Facebook page. They make wonderful posters that explain geometric concepts. I'm going to be using some of their drawings in later videos. They make manipulables, like, for example, this torus. Isn't this cool? And wait a second, are we going to find a torus in the hieroglyphic monad? Is anyone? Of course we are. It's John Dee. How can we not find a torus? We're going to find conic sections, kissing cones, if you're a student of Dan Winter, all of those things. Okay, back to Dee for a little bit more, and then I'm going to share my screen and tell you what's coming up in the remaining classes. I mentioned Dee was an underreader of ancient Greek at Cambridge under Henry VIII. Gave lectures on mathematics after that when he was still a very young man in Paris. Those were probably early theorems, perhaps of another work of his, the Promptomaata Aphoristica, but we really don't know. They've been lost, as was his collection of Hebrew grammars. He was also quite a linguist, and he collected Hebrew grammars, and we can tell from the title that he was doing Kabbalistic study, but those works also have been lost. He petitioned Queen Mary for a national library. She didn't listen, but it was a great idea. He had the largest library in England. And at the time that he was writing the Hieroglyphic Monad, he was traveling around collecting texts. After he finished the Monad, he continued working on theorems and revised another work of his theorems, the Promptomaata Aphoristica, which I'll talk about again in a minute. All right, let me just go ahead and share my screen And here we go. So welcome to my class on the Hieroglyphic Monad of John Dee. As I've already said, you can understand this. The time it takes to understand it is worthwhile. I've spent more than a decade of my life, so you don't have to. This is going to be an overview of the class. Here is the cover of the book that Nancy and I, the translation that Dr. Turner and I did. But in the upcoming videos, I will have everything you need. Again, if you can't get a copy of our book, I'll give you everything you need in terms of links and in the videos. Although I, of course, hope you buy it. Written in Antwerp in 13 days, the Hieroglyphic Monad is, as Dee describes it, it's a result of 7 years gestation. Now, while he's gestating on the monad, he's collecting books all over the place and maybe doing some intelligence work on the side. But notice the word here, 7. Dee loves the number 7. We'll talk about that more. It is dedicated to King Maximilian II. Not long after the monad comes out, King Maximilian becomes Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian, and his son is another Holy Roman Emperor, Rudolph II, who is in Prague 2 decades later when John Dee and Edward Kelly come in as part of their continental adventures. Dame Frances Yates is probably, well, one of and the most famous of the first wave of scholars to take Dee seriously in modern times. And she says that this symbol, the monad symbol, it appears in so many Rosicrucian places because the more secret philosophy behind the Rosicrucian manifestos was the philosophy of John Dee as summed up in his Bonus Hieroglyphia. Sometimes you hear that referred to as the Yates thesis or the controversial Yates thesis. I don't find it terribly controversial. I just think it's true. But moving on, C.H. Yostin did the last scholarly translation of this in 1964, the year I was born, almost 60 years ago. And he thinks that the Hieroglyphic Monad is a work of alchemy. By his word choice, we can tell he means physical alchemy. But unfortunately, he says that the specific message that Dee tries to convey by his symbol of the monad and his treatise thereon is lost. His explanations are sometimes explicitly addressed to emissiae and initiati whose secrets we do not possess. So by this line of thought, it's like Dee wrote this down, but to understand it, he explains it to you, and then you explain it to someone else. And certainly even Dee says that Queen Elizabeth I was one of the people he'd explained it to. But you have to have the gloss that goes along with it. At least that's what Yostin thinks. But he's wrong. I mean, I'm not clairvoyant and I don't time travel. I can understand it. You can understand it too. It's a problem of knowing the right context and taking the time. And again, I've taken the time, so you don't have to. Here's the monad symbol. Those of you who know Agrippan magic probably recognize this as a symbol for the sun, or if you're an alchemist, you recognize it as a symbol for gold. Sometimes it's also used as a symbol for Tifereth, which is associated with the sun and gold. And the sun, S-O-N, if you are into Christian Kabbalah rather than rabbinical Kabbalah. Dee will tell us that this is the moon. The union of the sun and moon can be many things, like, for example, an eclipse. But in the Hermetic tablet of Hermes Trismegistus, there's something very, very special. Among other things, that's why my husband and I got married during an eclipse. But moving on, this is a Hermetic text. And there are many, many reasons why I'm going to tell you. First of all, Dee talks about this as his Hermetic seal. He will directly quote the Emerald Tablet. This glyph appears a bunch of other places. Here's his Propoidomata Aphoristica, the one often referred to as a guide to navigation, although these words just basically mean a foundational group of teaching aphorisms that you should know before you learn anything else. And the monad symbol is on there. He sends this to Gerardus Mercator, the guy of the Mercator map projections. It also shows up in the chemical wedding of Christian Rosenkreutz. It comes out in 1616, the year Shakespeare dies. Here's the frontispiece of the Hieroglyphic Monad. These words at the top here translate to one who does not understand should be silent or learn. This is the frontispiece as rendered by our translation's wonderful artist, Michelle Anderst. Hats off to you, Michelle. She did wonderful work. And so here we'll see a hermetic egg. Maybe this symbol looks to you like Mercury. You might see symbols for the elements and so on. But wait a minute, this garland isn't translated. Did we just forget? Actually, I spend a couple pages in the introduction to our translation talking about this, and I'll talk about it in the next video as a way to show you John Dee's associative thinking and to ask, what is Mercury to John Dee? What is Mercury to an alchemist? Jennifer Rampling asked that question in a whole chapter of her wonderful recent book. But if we directly translated this, it would make no sense or require a very long footnote, which is what we did in an earlier translation. And you notice here, suddenly he's switching to Greek letters, and these Greek letters will be phonetically rather than in ancient Greek telling you a word. So we'll come back to this as a way to kind of get in the mind of John Dee. And how does this man think? He has one of the most associative, elusive, punning minds of anyone I have ever read. Quickly, some problems previous translators have had. Well, some of them have limited understanding of the context or they get it totally wrong. There's a bad translation in English, Spanish, French, German, probably other languages. But also there is the problem of assuming it was a work of physical alchemy. Look, there's no reason at all to believe that Dee was very good as a physical alchemist. He was a brilliant man. He was a great thinker. But it was his scryer years later, Edward Kelly, who was supposedly the one who was good at physical alchemy. It's a hermetic work first, and then lots of other things, a work of sacred geometry, a cosmogenic text. We'll talk more about it. But if you're trying to understand it as a work of physical alchemy, wrong work. The graphics are often not so much misunderstood as just ignored. So take this here. This is a tree, right? And if you know a little Latin, you probably know this arbor raritas would be rare tree. So suppose I'm doing a translation and I'm like, oh, okay, I'll just put in a little picture of a tree there. Someone who did that would almost ruin the whole effect of this section. This is a very important Pythagorean symbol, the Y. That was actually pointed out by C.H. Yost, and he got that, although he missed a few other things. And there are places where it's caps, small caps, right? There's a reason why Dee does all of these things, as he says in his letter to the printer. Ignoring puns and allusions. Think of if you have said something in one way or punned on something or told a joke and the person you're talking to just takes it straight literally. The joke will thud, or the comment might even be offensive. If you don't understand what he is alluding to, you can't understand the monad. But never fear, I'm here to help you with that. There is one real interesting case, and I have links to his work below, and that's James Egan, a fascinating man who I've had the opportunity to listen to a couple of times. He admits he doesn't know Latin, but he translates the monad, which is kind of a gutsy thing to do, okay? The Latin in his translation is pretty awful, but his understanding of the geometry in the book accompanying it it's kind of amazing. That is, he also figures out that if he uses the geometry of Buckminster or Fuller, that's real similar to the geometry of John Dee. And if you're into that kind of thing, you can go wild. You know, if you know like Fuller's tetrapumps and things like that and jitterbug, oh, you can go wild with that. Although I'm going to be basically using Cartesian geometry because that's what most people know. So Let me tell you what I'll be talking about in the next few videos, or more than a few, I guess. This is the introduction. Hi, thanks for watching to this point. In the next one, which will come out by July 4th, I'm going to talk about the context. I'm going to use the frontispiece to do that, and I'm going to use a few examples from later on in the letter and the theorems to talk about it as a cosmogenic hermetic text about how light takes form. The third one is his letter to King Maximilian, which is often not translated. We're going to do some decoding of it that hasn't been done before. And I promise you, once you understand the letter, and the letter for many people is the hardest to understand, which I think is why so few people translated it, but the rest will be easy. So if you get through video number 3, even though there's a lot to come, hey, you're home free. You're going to not have any problem understanding this. Then we'll look at the much shorter letter to Printer William Sylvius. We'll look at an overview of the theorems. We'll look at the first 10 of them, which is the story of creation. It's kind of a combination of one from Plato's Timaeus, Kabbalistic Genesis, and John Dee. Then we'll look at theorems 11, 12, where we are introduced to precessional astronomy or astrology. And if we, on one level, this is an alchemical text, okay, but not physical alchemy. So what does Dee mean by alchemy? One of the things he thinks of, along with, say, Ovid, is time as alchemy, and the Emerald Tablet as alchemy. You know, the famous end of the Emerald Tablet about the operation of the sun. The operation of the sun is an alchemical operation. Theorem 15 is sort of a coda to the ones before. Also, you get all kinds of wild puns about grammatical forms coupling, which like nobody but John Dee could not get away with it. We could all get away with it, but he does it, and most people just read by and they're like, Dee really likes grammar. Yeah, okay, moving on. Theorem 16. If you are in a Kabbalistically based order, like one of the many Golden Dawn spin-offs or the AA, you may know the LBX signs of the adept. This is the source and the only source of that, although it's not usually acknowledged. It also is something that I've explained in some videos with Dan Winter about. It's his explanation of conic sections that will lead into having a torus and a hypercube. When Dan talks about kissing cones, that's a lot like what goes on in this theorem. Theorem 11, we'll learn that the number 252 is the philosopher's stone, or at least it's the number of it. Why? Stay tuned. We'll get to that. Theorem 18, the hermetic egg and spiral in the great secret. Digression here about people who take Dee literally and don't get illusions. In this case, I'm talking about a very famous critical article that assumes that John Dee has a geocentric view of the world. That is, he thinks that the solar system goes around the Earth. The great secret here is that the Earth goes around the sun. Why doesn't Dee say so? 2 reasons. The first, which should be screamingly obvious to a scholar of Dee, is that think about what happened to Galileo. That was not a safe thing to say in Dee's time. And the second is, go back to my notion about astrology, or actually it's Heilbrun's notion of astrology as the first applied science. If you are looking at the influence of light upon you, or planetary light, or planetary reflections of solar light, you are standing on Earth. Anything that I interpret astrologically as having to do with me is by definition geocentric. My Malkuth, if I want to shift to the Kabbalistic concept, is where my feet are, and I'm on Earth. So different things transform. You begin in the first theorems with where you're standing on Earth. When you get up to theorem 18, we're looking for something more transpersonal, more tiphoretic, and suddenly the sun becomes the center. Okay, moving on. Theorem 19 will link us back to Dee's Propoida Moda Aphoristica and to Ovid's Metamorphosis, that wonderful alchemical allegory. Theorem 20 is his apocalyptic hypercube, and it's even better because the hypercube is inscribed in a hypersphere. And he does all of this, and it seems that he is talking about Jesus in Revelation, and maybe he is. But if you work it out, he's describing a hypercube, but he doesn't have the language to do it. Now, it's not only me that thinks that. A very good mathematician came up with that idea, not me, but we're going to talk about it. Theorem 21 will link to Plato's Timaeus. Theorem 22, okay, occultists out there, this is a significant number to you, right? The sum of the powers of creation in the Sefer Yetzirah. Why? Because there's 22 Hebrew letters, for those of you who don't know that. All right, so this is going to be an important theorem. Theorem 23 is it's a drafting demonstration of how to draw the hieroglyphic monad with a compass and straight edge. But it winds up being more than that, because he also, remember I said he liked the number 7. He winds up in the process of doing that, inscribing a heptagon that is a regular heptagon, a polygon with 7 equal sides, into a circle, which is a very hard geometric proof to do. Theorem 24 is a strange goodbye. Those of you that have read the monad know this one. It's like you go through all these things, you're waiting to figure out what's going on, and then Dee says, well, here most of you will despair considerably. The end. Parentheses, because you haven't understood this. Well, because of that, I'm going to say a little bit more about it and talk about how it links to the Rosicrucian stream and suggestions about who people likely were who did understand it. 19, I'm going to look at other translations, Hamilton Jones, Yostin, and Egan. If I'm real energetic, I might make an 18 A, B, and C, but I don't want to commit to that yet. 20, video 20, I want to look at it as a stage setter for his later works, including but not limited to the Enochian work. In video 21, this is something that I hope to write about much more, but if I don't, this will be my chance to talk about the hieroglyphic monad as an influence upon the original order of the Golden Dawn. I mentioned the signs of the adept. We'll also look at the double cubical altar. We'll also look at knowledge lectures. We'll look at some specific wording. It's a definite influence. And so whoever came up with that cipher manuscript definitely either understood the hieroglyphic monad or was taking dictation from somebody who did. It's kind of uncanny. 22, squaring the circle. Today, mathematicians would say you can't square the circle. That's because pi is an irrational number. And so if you're, and you don't need irrational numbers with a square, so you've got to have a fractional approximation. But squaring the circle becomes a metaphor for certain metaphysical concepts, which we'll talk about, and also linked to some really significant ratios. Also, there are those who say that Dee did square the circle. Now, what that probably means is with a compass and straight edge, there was an approximation, and many people have done that since. But there were 3 big or classical proofs in ancient Greek geometry. One was the doubling of the cube. We'll have that up here with the hypercube. One's the squaring of the circle. The third one is the trisection of the angle. Okay, 23, shout out to Discordians. Here we'll look at John Dee, cryptography and the hieroglyphic monad, particularly how it is an ideal tool to make clock ciphers. And then we'll end, as I promised, with an overview of scholarship and then what's helpful, what isn't, and areas where those of you who are interested in such things might want to explore further. Okay, that's where I'm going to be going over the next few weeks. The next one of these will come out on the 4th of July. After that, I will just have at least one out a week until I'm finished. Thanks for watching. If you're interested, please subscribe so you know when the next one comes out. Have a great day.